A little bit of context then for why I'm here. So, my name's Manny. I am a director of the Association of Church Accountants and Treasurers. So some of you, as Alex has said, will have crossed paths with me in the context of treasurer training. The last year's Wardens Day, I did a presentation on basically things you need to know about church finance when you're a non-treasurer trustee like a warden. I'm also in my day job, I'm actually a health and safety management consultant. So this is why I tend to treat this as my primary subject when I come and talk to this audience, because health and safety is a territory that is closer to the remit of the average church warden. Although really the main reason I got involved in doing these Wardens Day talks is that I grew up in a little Baptist church on the south coast called Seaford Baptist Church, where I knew this very nice couple called John and Jill Hughes. And in fact, Jill and I used to be trustees together of a small special needs support charity down there. So basically the reason I know Alex is because I know his family. So here's my slides. Right, so I should say a little bit about ACAT, because the Diocese of Ely does actually have a block membership of ACAT. In fact, should I be standing over here so that I'm actually visible to the camera there?
That's fine, don't worry.
Okay, so the Diocese has a block membership. This means that if you're here from a church that's affiliated with the Diocese of Ely, or anything else in the Diocese of Ely for that matter, diocesan team are also covered by this, then it means you're a member of ACAT automatically. You have access to member resources. This covers a lot of finance and accounting stuff, but some other general admin topics. We have bits and pieces on health and safety, bits and pieces on data protection, some building related stuff. If you don't know how to access that, ask one of the diocesan team. They'll be able to put you in touch with someone who can give you the diocesan login details for the members area of our website. You basically log in with the Ely Diocese details, and then you create your own individual account. As many of you from your church can do that as you like. It's not limited to one point of contact per church. And then you can access all the resources that we have. So if your treasurer is not engaging with that, then feel free to suggest it, because there's some useful stuff there. So, on to the subject that I'm prepared to talk about today, health and safety. This is very similar to something I did 3 years ago, that many of you won't have necessarily been there then, and I do have some slightly new things to say and some new ways to say them, so hopefully Alex will again be able to pick up something new. So the question that is often asked in churches is, how safe is safe enough? You know, you have these legal obligations to manage safety. How do we know when we're actually doing enough? Right, because we have a lot of different reasons for wanting to manage safety risk. Before we get into the specifics of that, it's useful to have a kind of a coherent, agreed understanding of what we mean by the term. I think actually if I stand on this side, I'm going to block fewer people's view, because on that side you're looking at that screen. So, we can define risk as an exposure to uncertainty. If you're a financial analyst, this could be good uncertainty or bad uncertainty. But if you're talking about health and safety, uncertainty is usually a bad thing. You know, predictability usually means everything is safe. We really hope that's the case. So the uncertainty is when something bad might happen, which means we tend in risk management to focus on adverse occurrences, and that's very much true in safety. We focus on things that might have a material impact on our ability to pursue and meet our objectives. So as churches, you have a mission. Stuff could go wrong that interferes with your ability to deal with that because it costs money, it damages your reputation, it ties up people's time and effort in dealing with the aftermath. Health and safety tends to be the risk territory that draws the most attention. 2 years ago I talked about risk management at one of these St Mary's, I think, in a more general sense, what risk management looks like for charity trustees across the board. Today we're looking at health and safety management. So what's the context for that in a local church? It's an organisation that may have some staff, but is typically involving primarily volunteers, making up the head count of people doing things. It's a relatively low hazard environment, we hope, certainly compared with most industrial and manufacturing contexts. So we're not going to manage health and safety the way someone running a factory would. And we often find that we have a lot of people who aren't very interested in formal process, who'll talk about health and safety gone mad the moment you suggest doing a risk assessment. You know, everything looks like red tape when you don't really like being formal about anything. We tend to characterise risk in terms of two dimensions: frequency, how often does the bad thing happen, and severity, how bad is the bad thing when it does happen. So stuff in the top right of this graph is high risk and the bottom left is low risk, but it's important to note that risk isn't just this kind of scalar quantity that goes from small to large. You can have two risks that you might think of as medium risks, one in the bottom right here where it's absolutely catastrophic but it hardly ever happens, and something in the top left which happens all the time but is completely trivial. These are two very different kinds of risk that require different ways of managing. We also need to distinguish our terminology. A hazard, an accident, and a risk are not the same thing, so we illustrate this with a hole in the ground, and if you know Exodus 21, then you'll realise what the reference there is. The hole in the ground that is uncovered, if a man uncovers a pit, that's the hazard. It's a situation with the potential to cause harm. The accident is the event in which someone falls down the hole. The risk is the exposure to the uncertainty around that accident happening. So the hole is the dangerous thing, that's the hazard. The accident is the event where harm is caused. Risk is how worried should we be about it. It may be that it's very severe if it's a particularly deep hole or has a spike at the bottom. It may be that we don't need to worry because it's hardly ever going to happen. So, why do we actually bother with this stuff? Why do we manage health and safety in a church context? Well, broadly speaking, the answers are the same for almost any context. They fall into three roughly distinct but somewhat overlapping categories. We have a moral obligation, we have the need to manage safety as an operational necessity for our organisations, and it's a legal duty. So let's unpack each of those. Moral obligation, we don't want to harm people. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Love your neighbour as yourself. Now, for a lot of people they'd say, okay, well, we're not going to harm people, but how responsible am I for stuff that happens that I could have prevented, but I didn't actually cause? So if someone falls down that hole in the ground, well, if you're not the one who pushed them down the hole, is that actually your moral responsibility? And I think there's a very strong case for saying yes, so we need to do more than simply not hurt people. I think I'm reminded when I talk about this of a conversation I heard between a man I very much respect as a father and his young son, and his son had been misbehaving, and he said, look, I didn't mean to be naughty. He said, well, it's not enough to not mean to be naughty. You have to actually try not to be. Yeah, it's not enough that you didn't mean for something to happen. You have to try and make the right outcome happen when that's within your responsibility. So this is where we get into Exodus 21. I gave you the little reference there to verse 33, which is about a hole in the ground. Most of these verses are actually talking about oxes that gore things or gore people. So this actually establishes, I like to see this as the Bible laying the foundation, as it does for so much else in British law. It lays the foundation for the principle of reasonable foreseeability. Because what the passage tells us is that if an ox gores a person, well, that's a tragic accident, that's terrible when that happens, but if the ox was known to have a habit of goring people and the owner didn't keep it penned up, then it was reasonably foreseeable that this might happen, and so now, if the ox has killed a person, the owner of that ox is now treated in the same way as if they were a murderer. And you know how that goes if you're talking Levitical law. If the ox kills an animal, then they've got a liability to make good and replace the animal or pay the value of it. So the point is, they are accountable for what their ox did if what the ox did was reasonably foreseeable and they were negligent. Deuteronomy 22 backs this up by talking about putting parapets around the roofs of buildings. Presumably, in the ancient world, people often had buildings with flat roofs, and so the roof was a functional space. If a man makes a house, he doesn't put a wall around the edge. The phrase guilt of bloodshed is used for the eventuality where someone falls off it. So, he didn't push them off, but he didn't do what was reasonable to prevent something that was reasonably foreseeable. Okay, what about the operational necessity? Well, there is this phrase that you sometimes hear, I quote it from this industrial safety expert called Trevor Kless, if you think safety is expensive, try having an accident. People who find, and it's not just about expense, if you think that doing a risk assessment is a tedious bore that takes time and effort, try dealing with the aftermath of a nasty accident that damages your reputation and opens you up to legal liabilities. It's disruptive, very disruptive. So the question becomes, do we care enough about our ministry and the fulfilment of basically our business objectives, our charitable objectives, the Great Commission? Do we care about that enough to avoid preventable disruption? So managing risk becomes a necessary part of operations. Finally, we have the legal requirement. There are general duties of charity trustees, and there are specific legal duties under health and safety law. And a conversation that sometimes happens in a church context is to say, well, that's all very well good. That's the law of the land. We answer to a higher power. That's more important. We're not interested. We're not going to fuss about all this silly administrative red tape from legal instruments brought in by Parliament. Well, I would say that Paul and Peter both would disagree with that.
Yeah.
And if you know those passages, you know they both say almost exactly the same thing. Honour the emperor, respect earthly authorities. God has put them in power for a reason. When earthly authorities are telling us to do something that doesn't actually go against the gospel, it's not an optional extra for us to maintain legal compliance. It's actually a biblical command. So you see how I said these are overlapping. The legal requirement actually becomes part of a moral obligation because it ties back to biblical principles, as does the operational necessity, because if we neglect our operations, we neglect our mission, we neglect our duty to God. So these are not completely distinct and separate concepts. Okay, we're going to talk about a few legal principles that will help you in general situations to answer the question, how safe is safe enough? UK health and safety law, and I say UK because it is in England, Wales and Scotland it's the Health and Safety at Work Act. Northern Ireland has its own thing, Scotland doesn't on this particular instance. So if I use the phrase UK health and safety law, know that there's an almost identical act in Northern Ireland that just has a few of the words in the title slightly changed, but it's basically a copy-paste job. UK health and safety law is remarkably non-prescriptive. It's a goal-setting law. It tells you the standard to reach, but it very rarely tells you specifically what you have to do. So, one of the important principles is reasonable foreseeability. Organisations are expected to manage risks that are reasonably foreseeable that might affect health and safety. So, taking that reference from Exodus, if the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past and its owner has been warned but has not kept it in. So that was a reasonably foreseeable hazard. This can be interpreted in three different ways. Common knowledge, so what does the man in the street, or if you prefer the person in the street, it doesn't have quite as good a ring to it in terms of rhythm, but it is less gender biased. Industry knowledge, what would someone who is familiar with the sector, with the business context know? And expert knowledge, what would an expert in the subject know? So what kind of reasonable foreseeability standard are you meant to apply? Well, at the very least, you should be anticipating anything that would fall under the common knowledge test. If the average punter who walks into the church on a Sunday morning could anticipate that something is hazardous, like a hole in the ground, that someone might trip in, okay, that's reasonably foreseeable by common knowledge. Actually, you need to go to a higher standard than that, because does the average person in the street always know that if you've got a warm water tank that you might get a Legionella risk? Not necessarily. Does the average person who's involved in premises management know that? You would expect that. And in a church, you're in the business of managing a premises. You're in the business of managing events. So look at comparable examples, primarily around premises and events, and apply the industry standard test. What would be considered common knowledge, or what would be considered industry knowledge? You are then expected to deal with anything that falls under the category of reasonably foreseeable. It's worth noting, by the way, the phrase reasonably foreseeable does not appear in the Health and Safety at Work Act. It's used to interpret the legal duties because it's a well-established concept in the common law around negligence, which goes back a lot earlier than the Health and Safety at Work Act. Now, I've mentioned that Act a few times. What's it properly called? It's called the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act of 1974. The etc. is surprisingly important. The etc. is what makes it sensible that this law doesn't just cover our duties as employers to employees, but as organisations employing people towards anyone else who might be affected by our activities. So it sets out general principles. There's then subsidiary legislation and regulation that deals with more specific risks, but even then a lot of it's pretty non-prescriptive. It sets out the role and powers of the regulator, the health and safety executive. The less you have to deal with them directly, the better things are probably going for you. And for charities, it's clear that the ultimate responsibility for meeting the legal duties set out here will sit with the charity trustees, which for you is going to be the PCC. Each case, unless anyone's here from a bishop's mission order church, in which case there might be a slightly different structure. But the point is, whoever are the trustees, those are the people who are legally on the hook for this stuff. As wardens, you may be in a position of being particularly aware of this among the trustees, but it's not a bad idea to remind the rest of your trustees periodically that they're all legally accountable for this, even if they're not paying the slightest bit of attention to it. They are still going to be in as much trouble as you, potentially more if they're not, making good on their duties. So, just something to keep in mind. There are three main sections I draw out on the Health and Safety at Work Act, or HSAWA, we sometimes abbreviate it. Section 2 sets out the duties of employers to their employees. For a lot of you, you're not going to be employers. There are a lot of smaller churches that don't employ anyone. Outside of the Church of England, you'd need to be a very small church or be in some sort of ministerial interregnum for that to be the case. But for you, because your clergy typically are remunerated by the diocese, you'll only be employing someone if you've then got someone else on top of that, so a second paid person. So it's very common for actually to not have Section 2 apply to you at all in the Church of England. Section 3 is the duty of employers as well as self-employed persons towards literally anyone else who might be affected by your activities. So in other words, if you employ at least one person, these legal duties don't just apply to how you look after that employee, they apply to how you look after literally anyone else who walks through your doors or could be in any way affected by your activities. Section 4 places a duty on controllers of premises. Now, even if you're not employing someone, there's a good chance that you are managing a premises somewhere, even if you don't hold a deed to it, because again, there's all sorts of complicated arrangements for exactly what property ownership looks like when you're a parish church that's part of a diocese. But the point is, if you're running the place day to day, you're going to fall under the duties under Section 4 towards anyone who has to use those premises for their work. So that is going to cover clergy who turn up there to actually, work there in their capacity in the church. It's also going to cover contractors who come on site to do work. Yes?
Does that then mean a lot of us employ a parish administrator, but they work from home? Does that mean we are then exempt from...
No, you are an employer, which means that you have the duties of Sections 2 and 3. The question is, are you an employer, not do they work on your premises?
Thank you.
So what are those duties? Well, the main duty is articulated in this way. It says that you have to ensure health, for employees, you have to ensure health, safety and well-being for other people affected. The wording only refers to health and safety, so far as is reasonably practicable. Health and safety professionals will often abbreviate this to the almost unpronounceable acronym SAFER. We call it the SAFER test. So what does that mean? Because it's a rather nebulously phrased way of putting things. We can say that reasonably practicable, we draw on a legal judgment that dates back to actually long before the Health and Safety at Work Act came in, 1949, Edwards versus Coal Board. It's this question that still gets used for interpreting it. It basically says reasonably practicable doesn't mean the same thing as physically possible. It says that you consider a thing that you might do to make things safer, and you consider how much safer will it make things and what's the cost. And cost there can mean time, effort, as well as money. And if the cost is grossly disproportionate to the safety benefit, you don't have to do it, but otherwise you do. So if they're balanced, or if the cost is just a little bit greater, you have to do whatever the thing is you were thinking about. Now, quantifying this is not something that you're usually going to do. This is not something you're going to get a calculator out for. It's more subjective, but essentially we're saying if there's something you can do, you have to do it if it will make things safer and if the cost of doing so is not grossly disproportionate. So this means it's not safety at any cost. It doesn't mean you have to do literally anything you could possibly do to make things as safe as possible, no matter the cost. You can say, no, I'm not going to do that. That costs a grossly disproportionate amount, therefore it's not reasonably practical. But it does mean that you can't just say, well, this costs more than the benefit, so we're not going to do it. You have to show that it's grossly disproportionate. The only definitive test is in court. It is up to the duty holder to make their own judgment. So the thing you need to do is make a decision and satisfy yourself that you could articulate that you had done everything reasonably practical if you were in court trying to defend it. You hope you never actually have to deal with that test. This is easier to understand if you put it on a flowchart. We ask the question, can a way of improving safety be identified which we haven't already done and we haven't already disregarded because it failed this SAFER test? And if the answer is no, well, safety has been ensured, SAFER, because we've done everything already that's reasonably practical. There's nothing else we can identify to improve safety. If we can find something that we could do, we ask, is the cost in terms of time, trouble and money grossly disproportionate to its benefit? And if the answer to that is yes, don't implement it. If the answer is no, do implement it, and then start over again. Is there anything else? And when you have exhausted all the possibilities for making something safer, and everything that you could do has either been done or has been understood to be not reasonably practicable and therefore not done, then you can say, right, there's nothing left to do. We have now ensured safety so far as is reasonably practical. It's actually a very logical principle. But it's very subjective how you judge what is and isn't reasonably practical. how do we demonstrate that we've met this in practice? Because, you know, you could understand if you could stick numbers on all of this, you could do a calculation and you could weigh up the cost against the benefit. And in high hazard industries where there's lots of safety data available, this is often what's done. But you're not going to do this when you're making a judgment about safety procedures at a church. You know, are you going to improve the railings that protect the edge of the balcony? Or is it okay to run this particular event off-site? So what we instead tend to do is we look at recommended good practice. Right? There will be subsidiary regulations, there will be health and safety executive guidance. And the general principle for a lot of this guidance is if you follow the guidance, the courts will deem that you have passed the SAFER test. If you decide not to follow the guidance, you need to have a good reason for justifying why you've chosen not to. This is particularly true for a series of documents sometimes called the L series, which you can buy in hard copy, but you can download them and read them as PDFs from the HSE website for free. So if you find you're getting redirected to a shop page to buy them, that's for sending off for a hard copy. You can actually just read these things online for free. They're also called ACOTs, Approved Codes of Practice. If it's in the L series, it has what's called a special legal status. They are not legally mandatory per se, but they are commonly used by the regulator and the courts to interpret whether or not someone has passed the SAFER test. So basically, if you've got relevant guidance, for instance, there's a specific ACOT for Legionella. So if you're managing the risk of Legionella in your buildings, default, try to follow the guidance. If you deviate from the guidance, make sure that you can justify the basis for why you're deviating. Essentially, it's saying, if you don't follow the guidance, it's on you to have a good reason that you can articulate as to why. There is this question about, right, how worried should we be if we're not an employer at all? So if you're not an employer, then sections 2 and 3 of HSWA don't directly apply. Section 4 will still apply if you're controllers of premises, which is often going to be the case. If you are in breach of a section that applies to you, it's worth noting the breach of the Act is the failure to ensure safety to a particular standard. It's not whether or not someone gets injured. So if you are unlucky enough that someone gets injured even though you have ensured safety so far as is reasonably practical, remember this is risk, these are random events, there's uncertainty, you could just get unlucky. But if you can show that you managed the risk to the required standard, you will not be guilty of a criminal act. Whereas if you don't manage safety to the required standard, and you are lucky enough that regardless no one gets injured, you could still technically be committing a criminal breach. It's just that it's when people get injured that people tend to flag this stuff. So if someone looks and goes, that's not very safe, I'm going to report this to the local authority or to the HSE, well, you could end up with a criminal prosecution even if no one's been injured. However, that's criminal law. When we talk about civil law, if someone gets injured, they could potentially sue you. Now that's only going to happen if an actual injury occurs, and then they're going to need to demonstrate that you had a duty of care. The reasonable foreseeability test will be applied. You know, was there something that you should have done to maintain your duty of care that you then didn't do that directly led to the accident? And you don't need to be under the Health and Safety at Work Act in order to be liable for a civil suit. So it may be the case that that if you're not an employer and you don't control your own premises and none of these section 2, 3 or 4 duties apply, you should still be managing health and safety as part of managing the risk of avoiding getting sued if someone gets injured. Also, a rather important point, there seems to be a growing body of case law to say that the term employer as used in the Health and Safety at Work, etc. Act could be used in the context of volunteers. So someone who oversees volunteers might be deemed to be an employer for the purposes of the law. There is some growing legal precedent for that. So actually, even when you don't employ anyone per se, you could still fall fully under this Act. But that's a question of court interpretation. And so far, I don't think there are any examples that I've found where an organisation with absolutely 0 employees has been deemed to be an employer. But it could happen. So basically what I'm saying is, take health and safety seriously even if you're not an employer, because remember, it's not just a legal duty, we had all the moral and operational stuff from before. There are some other regulations that we need to give a quick note to. There is this thing created under HSWA called the Management Regs for short. Again, that's something we tend to call it in the health and safety profession. The Management of Health and Safety at Work Regulations 1999. This is the bit of legislation that puts a duty on employers to make what's called a suitable and sufficient assessment of risk. If you do this and you have 5 or more employees, which is not going to be the majority of you, I would imagine, you're legally obligated to document that risk assessment. But personally, I would say if you're going to do a risk assessment, you should probably be documenting it. There's not much point in doing a risk assessment and then not writing something down. For one thing, it does help cover you in the event of a civil suit. But this gets us to our overall conclusion, because I could have talked to you about, we don't have time to do exploration of detailed topics. We could have talked about working at height, electricity, gas, fire safety, first aid, cleaning chemicals and how you store them, Legionella, asbestos. If in doubt, for all of these areas, while there are sometimes some specific things that it's recommended that you do, and occasionally there's a very specific legal duty, for the most part, the answer to the question, what do we do, is the same. Conduct a suitable and sufficient risk assessment, identify all reasonably foreseeable hazards, and then manage them so far as is reasonably practical. And if you can satisfy yourself that for any given safety issue you're doing that, you will be meeting your legal obligations and you will be making things safe enough. ACAT is on social media, we have a website, email these email addresses if you have any queries. Incidentally, the membership email is the one you want to get hold of if you want to get the login details, though to be fair, CAF on the training one would also answer that question.